Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Shift Left is a dead end for cloud security. I'm James Casagrande. I'll be your moderator today. If you don't know Sonrai, we are all about total control of permissions in your cloud. We've been securing AWS, Azure, GCP, a couple different clouds here for a number of years with a laser focus on permissions. Quick housekeeping. If you've got questions today, please throw them in the chat. The more questions, the better. Even if you just have different opinions, you don't agree with something we're saying, or you did it a different way, tell us. We just want this to be as much of a dialogue as possible. So feel free to give feedback. We'll address the questions as we can throughout the session, and we'll get to them before we wrap at the end if we have some left over. Joining me today are two people I'm very proud to call colleagues. First up is Cole Horsman. Cole is our field CTO here at Sonrai. Cole's been a security analyst, a cloud analyst, a VP of cloud security, you name it. But he's been responsible for the cloud running and running securely for media companies, IT companies, and major financial institutions. So he's been trying to answer this question from sort of the CloudOps and side for a number of years, and he can bring you that perspective. Hi, Cole. How you doing?
Hey, good, James. Thanks for the intro. How are you?
Excellent. Thanks for joining me. And then, of course, last but not least, we've got Brad Peters. Brad's been a senior developer since the Bronze Age, and for the better part of a decade, he's been the lead architect here at Sonrai. And so Brad can give that developer perspective as well. Although he's been on you could say you sort of sit on both sides of the fence sometimes, Brad. But anyway, hi, Brad. Nice to see you.
Hi, James. Thanks.
Thanks for joining. So this is our quick little agenda here. We're just going to say, why is this different for Shift Left? Why is cloud identity different? We're going to give that cloud ops perspective. We're going to talk about some journey to star, which I think some of you are going to know what that means. We're going to talk about what the burdens that get put on development that are not generally accounted for when we start these Shift Left projects. And then we're going to get into sort of the centralization options at our disposal. Using just new methodologies and stuff, homegrown stuff we can build at home. So first, to level set, though, obviously we're being a little provocative with the title, right? Shift left itself is fine. We're not saying never shift left. It's like saying don't eat carbs, right? You should probably eat carbs. You're going to eat carbs, except in certain situations. Cloud identity happens to be one of them. Now, cloud identity, quote unquote, as a term has had like a weird decade, it feels like. There's this semiotics issue, right? Where the meaning of that you envision in your head is often not the meaning that is put out by the cloud providers when they use that term, just because it's evolved to take this divergent path. If you're on this call, you probably know that our principal in the cloud is likely to be a machine identity, acting on behalf of a service, a workload, whatever, but it's rarely acting on behalf of a human user's direct input, right? It's several layers of abstraction away from a human. I think we all kind of get that now, right? That's the explosion of NPIs, non-person identities, that you see on this right-hand chart here. And these numbers, by the way, are from our own proprietary research of a bunch of clouds in the US and Canada. And we find that, not only do NPIs dominate the cloud, they're also extremely over-permissioned. And that's the result of this issue that we're talking about today. Now, couple that with the fact that there are well over now 19,000 unique permissions in a cloud like AWS. And I'm pretty sure the count over across the three major clouds is probably approaching 50,000. And you have a significant scale problem that you are trying to control. So asking developers to really manage the security of such a large piece of what really now is infrastructure, right, and identity, is a burden. And it's something that security tooling, unfortunately, doesn't address, because security tooling is still using that old definition of identity. So instead of having, something that's built to handle this type of scale and this type of identities being used by ephemeral compute and all these other idiosyncrasies, we're still treating them like they're human users. There's a certain number of them. and a certain number of admins, and we just need to control those. So that's why shift left is a little different, right, when it comes to cloud identity. So to get into it, Cole, you've been trying to solve this problem for years and years. You've been doing it at, like I said, you were at a big financial institution. You've been doing it at all sizes of clouds. And you're not somebody, I feel like, who's been just, forcing it down the developer's throat. You've tried to a bunch of different approaches that have tried to be developer friendly and be a sort of collaborative approach on shift left. But you still ran into a bunch of challenges. Take us through what those challenges were and what your approaches were and why you sort of ended up to a point where you got frustrated with shifting left here.
Yeah. Let me start kind of from the beginning. So when I was in insurance, when we started going through a greenfield deployment, we had this legacy environment, we had this new deployment, and we wanted to do things the right way. We saw a lot of bad practice in AWS 1.0, we'll call it. A lot of access keys, a lot of star admin policies and things like that. So naturally, you're inclined to go try to say, let's go do this the right way. And by that, you think in the beginning, we're going to do least privilege. We're going to get really prescriptive on what permissions we're going to allow developers to do. Your runners, your like you called out, like your instance profiles or your roles associated with a server or a serverless function or things like that. You have great intentions. What ultimately ends up happening is you cause friction. Now you've got this environment that we have to maintain, this legacy environment, and you have this new environment. Meanwhile, so that's essentially doubling the workload. And now you're asking developers to do more with their policies to get better at policy development, which is not an unreasonable ask, but it is when you're trying to get it perfect out of the gate. So it's to your point, human and non-human access. But we had to kind of fix both. I mentioned the GitLab runners, so we were essentially trying to do least privilege even with deployments. Trying to get really granular, and it was back and forth. And every day there would be multiple permissions that we'd need to add to get these things deployed. It was not sustainable. I was a party of one in that era. I got helped some later on, but it's not attainable for me to go back and just be the only identity person. Again, like you pointed out, I'm doing cloud security kind of overall. So there's several mechanisms that we had to do, but a lot of it was just kind of feeling pain together. Brad, I know that you've kind of gone through this too. I didn't want, and like you called out, James, that's kind of exactly where I had a little bit more, what I thought success was because empathy. I could feel what Brad was going through when I would ask him, hey, you need to go fix this policy. This needs to be updated. And Brad or somebody in that situation would be like, I can't do this all day. I got to deliver. Brad, so I know you felt that pain, and I know that you've probably been on, on teams where somebody was empathetic and teams that just said, that's the way you got to get it done. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about your experience being on the other side of the security guy.
Yes, exactly. So it does, a lot of it comes from kind of that. Again, for us, we're an identity company, so we also try and get to least privilege. We have an understanding that that's really the end goal, but it is quite difficult to achieve. And a lot of it does, as you mentioned, come to the timing of how long things take to iterate through the cycles and the back and forth, sometimes red tape, sometimes no red tape, to get that there. And when you're being empathetic and you say, yeah, I understand, excuse me, that as engineers, you need to have some flexibility. But then you start to kind of lose your hold on what you've got for locking it down. So the farther left you push it, the kind of bigger it has to become, the broader it has to come to kind of maintain the velocity from the engineering side. And also, the knowledge, as far as if you tell me you have to do this because this permission is a problem, well, how would I know that unless I'm a person that understands? I just looked at the AWS thing and I said, I need to be able to use this service to make things. So I'm going to go do that. And even from the architectural side, a lot of times, this isn't particularly a shift left problem, but the clouds themselves will impose permissions on you that you don't necessarily want to give them in order to use a service a particular way. That, then that becomes a bit of a battle when you're trying to do least privilege, that AWS has to have this permission, or you must grant your runner this permission in order to do what you're doing. In a lot of cases, that's kind of what I've seen you run into those scenarios, where you kind of have to then broaden your horizon or broaden your scope, so to speak.
And you said something a minute ago that I would kind of tap into as well. When you're telling, so from my perspective, when you're asking application teams, developers, whomever, DevOps, to go clean these things up, it kind of falls on deaf ears if you're not correlating it to some kind of risk. So then it becomes more overhead on me. I'm like, well, I can't go to you with a problem and not like say, here's why this is important. So we did a lot of workshops together on identity, on the why we're doing this and why this could lead to it. And then we kind of ultimately landed to, how does this correlate risk, and kind of stack ranking risk. Like I said, we started out kind of trying to solve all the way down to granular. That wasn't going to work. Correlating it to risk kind of helped us figure out, well, okay, we know this isn't attainable. So perhaps, we could say, if you need S3, maybe you do that, but we just don't star the resource. So we started iterating on like what we were requiring, at least if we were getting specific with resource. We could go back later and, intentions, we all know about good intentions and how they're paved. But the thing is, that's something that I can work with. If we're doing that to a specific resource, that is A, better than nothing. And B, I think it kind of gets us on the path of like that iterated, get that mindset together.
And you also run into a bit of a scenario kind of to the tagline here that policies don't change. If I define a policy today that is least privilege, it may not be least privilege tomorrow because my code doesn't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. Nothing's going to break if I have a permission I don't need, but it's no longer least privilege. And you kind of get a bit of that bookkeeping on the other side, that maybe it's not my code's broken because I don't have the permission. I have a bunch of permissions I no longer use because we implemented it a different way. And obviously, as an engineer, the code's going to get released. It's going to work and it's going to go. So it's, then you've got kind of a permission leak, so to speak.
The other thing too, James, stop me if I'm over here, but like the other thing I would call out too, specifically when you said those permissions aren't used, I remember multiple scenarios where we were in a situation where, think about like attaching a network interface. You really only need to do that once in a lot of cases when you're deploying. But if you ever go to redeploy and you remove that permission, you are not going to be able to redeploy without being able to keep that network interface policy included on there. So all that to say, and James, I'll let you take it from here, but all that to say, even when you're doing it right, it's still very stressful to go back and get to least privilege for the fear of breaking, not just on the app teams. I don't want to be on the other side of that either. The guy that took away network interface permissions and they go to redeploy, and it was my fault because I told him to go remove that permission because it's never been used in my visibility.
Yeah, and you can lead to I know I've heard of engineers pushing back and be like, no, we do need this. You can't take that away. It's mine. Not that it's mine that I'm protected, but I know it's going to get used at some point in the next 6 to 12 months. Exactly as you described, it's hard within a reasonable tool to kind of lay down some guidelines or some boundaries when, again, the timelines get broad, not just the permissions.
Yep.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cole.
No, I think that's exactly how it ended too.
So yeah, speaking of which, right? So Brad, we have this cheeky journey to star, which I don't know, gave me all these biblical visions of wise men following a star. I don't know why, but you have these issues of the unknowns of the future, the unknowns of look back and whatever, and it does seem like when people come to vendors like us, this is the problem they're griping about, is they're saying, well, I just have star everywhere, and they want to sort of blame their development team for just over permissioning to make things easier for themselves. But there's a reason we get here, right? It's a rational sort of course. So take us through why you as someone who is a really security conscious architect, right, end up getting to star in places that you know you shouldn't, because it just feels like the system's designed to push you that way.
Yeah. So, I have kind of what I'll call recent firsthand experience going through this process where, I had got into the AWS console, said, I'm going to create a resource and this is going to be easy. It took me less than an hour. I had the thing up and running and it was working. And then I was like, okay, now I need to put this in Terraform, obviously, so we can productize it and move it through our environments. And it took me almost 3 weeks to convert something that was an hour of time because the thing was public. I turned on all the permissions. None of that mattered when I was just testing it. But when I went to go do it, I'd be like, this is great. I will Terraform it. Now, my Terraform runner doesn't have the permission to do what it needs to do, kind of as Cole alluded to earlier. My runner needs to be updated, and my runner hasn't done this particular thing in a period of time. So you get kind of bumping up against these least privilege things. So like, okay, well, I will now, in this case, I could have said, all right, well, I'm going to add these permissions, and I try to do something in Bedrock and it doesn't work because the model I need is not in the thing, or the inference profile I made has this other exception and it makes up some extra resource attributes that I need to consider. Well, then I could just put Bedrock star and then all my stuff works. But then, maybe I need Bedrock star and I need something else, and I got to put my data to read it out of S3 into something. And I end up putting S3 star in there because that's, that works for me. And I don't have to keep going back to the Coles of the world and saying, can you approve this again? Can you approve this again? Even to the point of like, I know I'm going to, in 6 months from now, need this permission. I'm going to ask for it today, when maybe 6 months never happens. Plans change down the road and things don't ever get it built. So you kind of end up in that world where you're pre-asking, knowing the pain that you may experience. You end up asking for more privilege than you need because you don't want to have to come back in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months and ask for it again. And you also end to, to the point of architecting things to do too much, you end up with kind of not just monolithic as far as code bases, but monolithic as far as capabilities and permissions required. Again, probably a whole nother segment to talk about, as far as compromised applications that end up with world permissions that, ideally you have some other boundaries in them. But, you kind of evolve from best intentions to a little bit not so great intentions to the point where you kind of just give up. Were I not in working on what I was working on, where I had the time to get the 3 weeks to get this done properly, there was a couple times where I was like, that's it, guys, we got to make it public. This isn't going to work. And they're like, no, there is a way. Just, let us work together and figure out something to get this across the line. So, from the engineering side, you get kind of, you just kind of want to ask for it and see if you'll get it. Sometimes it makes your life easier.
Yeah. And Cole, I'm sure that's what you dealt with on your end as well. I mean, but you kind of see the justification.
Yeah, what Brad was saying is absolutely true. And when someone needs to update runner permissions, application team developers do not have, at least in our environment, didn't have access to update those permissions. So they're coming to us. We're scratching our heads thinking, what is this project? Why are we doing this? What architecture is it? Is this related to? If it doesn't have permission, it hasn't happened yet. So why are we in this situation? Now we got to have another meeting. Now we got to go figure out, what's going on here. And I think it kind of comes down to, again, more, it does lead to more like discussion on what is happening. And we had a lot of like weekly meetings on just what was happening for what projects they were working on, what roadmap bumps they were coming into. But all of these things eat through time. And when you're trying to deliver and you've got to get your runner permission updated to then go update your permissions and we can't expect them to be, developers to be IAM engineers plus like updating runner permissions for, centrally for everyone else. It's just asking quite a bit to get to this point. So I can empathize with that. We started to kind of, again, I think that's the gist of this. I won't get too far ahead of myself, but we started to look for building guardrails to allow them to work within the guidelines rather than it felt like we were working against each other in this model to where everything's back and forth.
Yeah, you really don't want to get caught in the churn of the policy machine, where every level of I need to add this permission to my resource that I'm trying to deploy, but deploy my resource, somebody else has to add permission to their thing, and then somebody else has to add permission to their thing. That's 3 meetings right there. That, if you can define a broader approach or a kind of a more centralized approach, you kind of don't have to have those meetings because things kind of just work.
Yeah. Ultimately, we ended up probably skipping to a little bit of the answer here, but we ended up kind of crowdsourcing the runner repo. So, I mean, you can go ahead and make a change if you need to add something that's going to route an approval, and that just relies on your core cloud team to approve. And again, if it gets updated for one team, it gets that we've approved this throughout. Then you can obviously see now your runner, the stack of permissions that your runner is growing and growing and growing, and it's not ever going back. So
yeah, exactly.
Catch 22.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody ever says, policy team, can you take away permissions you gave me 6 months ago?
Yeah.
I don't need them anymore. That's very rare. I was actually quite surprised. One of our engineers came to me a couple of weeks ago and he's like, do we still need this permission in our Terraform? I was like, well, actually, we do actually. It is important. That is a important piece, but I'm glad you came and asked me about it. Because I mean, that shows the diligence at least on his side, doing these cleanups. So
that has never happened to me. So good on him.
Yeah.
So before we get to solutions, right? We know it's just annoying for development, but like, let's walk through really what happens, Brad, to development, when it comes to having this extra responsibility and why it's particularly burdensome with identity. And I put this graphic on here because you brought up a good point when we were discussing this earlier. We were trying to say what Cole's role was, right, when he was trying to do this. We actually couldn't define fully. We're like, oh, actually, well, is he cloud ops? Is he security? Is he DevOps? And it's like, well, this is the scope of this is kind of the heart of the problem, is that this is something that sits in between a bunch of people. It seems like it's a bit of a hot potato, and it feels like it just kind of lands because of under the guise of shift left, sort of lands on dev, but it brings these issues that really kind of rear their ugly head come audit time, really. But take us through sort of the extra burdens that people might not be thinking about with shift left and why we kind of need to avoid it with identity.
Yeah, the bigger one probably for us is kind of the audit scenario is, I need to prove that my identities are configured a certain way, or I need to prove, to an auditor, I need to get examples of things that are done a certain way. When it is a hodgepodge and kind of things are where I put them, not necessarily where I put them because I'm the engineer that decided to put them there, then I have to go find them because whoever's doing the audit, if they aren't, in this triangle, the one that had the responsibility, those things are where whoever decided to put them. And, you do end up either getting bogged down in policy or bogged down in, I can't put anything in here until the right person in the right place says, yes, that's fine. You kind of get really slowed down in your process. You end up, now not saying, things like SOC 2 and these other processes are bad and the engineer shouldn't understand them. But it kind of comes to audit time where you get stuck in that. And, as you said here, it's very manual process. And you kind of get caught up in if I need to do this, I need to talk to this person, whoever this person is, the Coles of the organizations, how to do it. And again, it gets cumbersome, in that flow. I don't know, Cole, if you managed to come up with a total for yourself from once we last spoke, where you fit in this.
No, but I will add to the audit thread. Honestly, I hate to even say it out loud. I cringe a little bit, but I think audit was kind of weaponized where we were at to get some priority. So I worked for multiple publicly traded companies, and audit kind of changed for us overnight when we became public, and we were auditing the wrong things prior. But then they started to kind of get down in there and see what was going on with identity. And it became kind of a driver at first for human access. Now, auditors, I will tell you, every year they're getting a little bit better at auditing. But I will tell you, when we first started auditing, they had no clue how to audit cloud. And I'm not going to use this as a soapbox, but I spent a lot of time training auditors how cloud identity works. And then the more that we uncovered, the more we said, that's probably not right. I've always been of the opinion that an audit should benefit three groups of people. It should benefit the consumer, where we're protecting their data. It should benefit the company that's being audited, because your controls get better, you're held to high standards, and you're accountable for it. And then it should help auditors, kind of like, hey, that they're doing their due diligence, and they're doing this to benefit everyone else. But I think that was part of it, was that audit component became kind of a crux of kind of getting some of this stuff prioritized and fixed. It did ultimately get us on the right track, but it is a lot of overhead to kind of go through this processes. We ended up getting pretty good at automating audit controls to where we knew, what humans belonged in what group, what access they had to what resources in AWS. But I will say, in the beginning, to kind of get this thing a little bit more prioritized, it was probably weaponized.
Yeah. All right. So we've got all these issues. Yeah, very negative so far. Let's talk centralization. Let's talk what's the anecdote, what's the antidote. We know we went away from a lot of centralization for speed purposes, right? It's just we don't want developers running into centralized controls that are just not going to help, or actually just going to slow down more than shift left. So with that perspective in mind, guys, let's start with number one, and we'll walk our way to number four here. What are you telling people to do instead of shifting left with identities in the cloud?
So I'll start here with, for number one, we've been doing a lot here. What I've been doing is you kind of can look at your Terraform that you have, the policy that you're about to write. And I mean, AI exists. AI is really good at understanding things that are out there to be understood. And it has a somewhat semblance of how the clouds work. And a lot of times it can get you pretty close to what would be a least privilege policy. And this cover, it kind of goes under the, how is the engineer supposed to know if it's sensitive? How is the engineer supposed to know that this permission is good or bad? Or even when I'm running this Terraform to create this resource, what permissions does my runner need to do that? To connect those dots, AI is really good at that. It will get you in a ballpark that's pretty close. And arguably you could probably say, give me somewhere between this and star that is safer. And it would probably give you something, that may not be the star that you want to put in there as an engineer, but give you some semblance of a simpler policy that, could be reviewed by your policy team or whatever, and say, yeah, this policy is better than star, obviously. And maybe it's a little more permissive, but it's nothing egregious. I'll say. Cole, I don't know your feelings on AI policy generation.
Yeah, for me, I guess in kind of some of the later experience that I had, I would combine, like 1 and 2 are kind of correlated. So when I'm in my IDE and I'm building a policy, I would take a look at the Terraform plan and have it give a policy based on the plan as a stage, and then check off kind of the same thing. But again, check off's just kind of low hanging fruit. I wouldn't spend all my day developing check off policies. That's for preventing star admin. There's a repo out there for what they look for in IAM policies. Can get you pretty far. And then there's some things like if you're doing some attribute based access control, you can build some custom policies and check off as sort of gates or stages within your pipeline or whatever the case may be. For those are kind of like those prereq checks that I would do. And to your point, Brad, number one, like when you're doing AI generated policy, even based on a Terraform plan, where it's got a pretty good handle on what it is, not perfect. And ultimately your project is going to, your project scope is going to increase. You're going to have to go back to that thing and figure out how to rerun that thing. It's not perfect. It's better than nothing. And I honestly think that the only way, that you're going to even get close out of the gate when you're not an IAM developer or engineer is with AI. It's going to give you a better shot at it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a better place to start than star.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah,
also
for
on
sure.
top, if you have build pipelines that are running, say, check off and say you can't use star, then what do you do? You're kind of handcuffed. So,
Mhm.
the ability to get something that's close is really helpful. Number three, Cole, I think this came out of one of your past experiences as well, the resource policies.
Yeah, and just calling that one out. I mean, and the reason this was important to kind of go the resource based when you get there, because if you've used Access Analyzer, and what we were planning to do is build a pipeline end to end that would analyze the permissions that were used in your previous stages, your development scope, and then it would come back and spit out a policy, correct the policy or whatever. But what it doesn't do, what Access Analyzer doesn't do, is give you the resource that it applies to. So we figured if we could define the resource, or have developers define the resource, then we could use Access Analyze to determine the permissions that were needed and use those in conjunction. So again, that's probably where I'd start for, especially if you just today, you leave today and you want to go start improving. Figure out what things your identities need to access, the resource it needs access to, and then kind of start there. You can't, not can't, I don't like the word can't, but it doesn't seem realistic to go back and say, I'm going to go find all 5,000 identities, and by the end of the year, by golly, I'm going to have it down to least privilege. It's not going to happen. If you figure that out, then you should be giving the webinar, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely complicated. There's so many touch points.
Mhm.
And then looking at number 4, the guardrails, kind of for, again, in the theme, the 10 commandments, is thou shalt not ever do these things in your organization. Kind of let you put a guardrail on top and a big umbrella on top of everything, that says these are the things that as an organization we will not let you do. Now, all of the clouds have some more granular things, say in this organizational unit or in this folder we'll let you do it, but we will not let you do it in production under any circumstance. But if you're in a development section, you can play around with some services or try some things, under where we're not under the same audit constraints, et cetera. But you don't want to run into the same journey to star problem where you end up having to open your SCPs so wide that you get bogged down in the minutia of those, that they become star permissions everywhere, and then irrelevant almost.
Yeah, the other thing I think that we talked about too, Brad, previously, was that every one of these is introducing not a new friction point, but a new area that you're going to have to troubleshoot at some point when you start doing, SCPs, you start doing, things like permission boundaries and IAM policies and things like this. Each one of these is something that a developer is going to have to troubleshoot or get some sort of feedback. Now they got to go look at CloudTrail logs, like, what on earth is blocking me this time, security guys? What are you guys doing? So each one of these is something, it requires some level of understanding and some feedback mechanism for a developer. Otherwise, they're flying in the dark and all they're hitting is access denied. And I'll tell you, who wants to work in that environment? That's not you got to consider retention at some point, to where if you're creating an environment that's not fun to work in, that's going to be hard to justify later on.
Yeah, and even if you take what you decide in your cloud as configuration and policy, but if that's not something that's easy to communicate to your engineers, it's just not going to happen. If I don't have access to the org to go look and see what SCPs are in place, nor should I. So to your point, how would I know that something I'm about to do is going to break because there's an SCP somewhere, if there's no external communication of that's easily consumable as well?
James, we've gone full circle right back to problems again. Sorry.
That's okay. You guys
I
are
was
both
I
just
do like
trolling.
on this slide, I do like kind of if I was to look at this from the audit perspective and the engineering burden, if you kind of look at this almost from 4 to 1 backwards, you can say in your policies that I have defined, these are the 10 commandments, if you will, for our organization. Here's some policy that we have in place. We have to have resource permissions, and you can use checkoff to enforce that in your policies. You can have, essentially a handful of checkoff rules that are fairly broad, but at least there's a policy that you have in place that can be audited. And a lot of that, and then you get the AI to help your engineers get through these checks that you've put in place. You know, you could even say, here's my checkoff rules, write me a policy that lets me do what I want to do, but passes these. You know, it lets the burden kind of goes away. Someone can define 3, 4, and 5, or, you know, 2 and 4, and kind of end up with an audit story almost, at some level, without having to go into the minutia of each particular policy.
So the attractiveness of those org level guardrails, right, is they're, well, just having fewer of them, like having one place, like you can have way fewer SCPs instead of having 10, like we saw the number before, you know, 19,000 identity attached policies, identity based policies, right? But as we've said, yeah, you run into the same issue. You sort of end up having to define them extremely broadly. Otherwise, you just run into frustrating developers again. So, quick plug for Sonrai. That's kind of where we come in. If you're looking to automate at that scale, we sort of flip the concept of identity in cloud around and focus on what privileges identities have rather than their immutable characteristics, and saying this is an admin role. You know, okay, well, what services does this identity have access to? And talking about communication and feedback into a developer when they can't use something, that's where we use permissions, privilege on demand, and just-in-time access. That's right integrated into your chat ops, whether that's Slack or Teams, or an email. And that just makes it a much smoother process for you to grant permissions back to people after you've put in some guardrails. So again, trying to address the scale problem by leveraging those centralized org level policies, but making it so that we automate the management of them for you. And then the communication back to development is much smoother, and it's working where they're already working. So it's we call it Cloud PAM. It's a different perspective on privilege access management. But we think it's super important to communicate, because it's more purpose built for the way, again, identities are sort of a piece of infrastructure now, right? They are not really what we used to think. And so we have to manage them differently, both as vendors and as security folks and as developers. So that's our scheduled content. Brad, Cole, thank you very much. Just a couple questions here, and then we'll wrap in about a minute or so. Managed policies, using managed policies. We get questions about this all the time. Cole, talk to us. Should we use them? How should we use them? Yeah.
So we started down the managed policy path. I'll tell you why. Audit. Once again, audit. I kind of figured out early on, if I could just point an auditor to a Google page or Google a page that says, this is AWS administrator, go look at it yourself. I'm not going to explain this policy to you. That was the easiest way for me to get out of it from an audit perspective, is if I could use managed policies, I could send an auditor to that policy and they could go look it up themselves. And I think that we used it in a couple of other scenarios where we're doing prescriptive role-based access. So in a development account, a developer is getting a power user access and a read-only access. In a QA prod, they're getting read-only. So there's a time of, especially for role-based access and getting something started, if you have account segregation to where you have it a happy path for developers to go down, then I'd say there's a place for it. But there's almost always a gotcha. So there's times when you're going to need to add custom policies with them, but I also do encourage using managed policies where you can't. Get you out of the business of creating a bunch of fine-grained policies when you don't have time. Brad, anything that you'd add there?
I think in our case, almost everything we build is a microservice of some sort that has some cloud capability. In those cases, perhaps the managed policies may be a little too broad. But depending on what you're building, if I was to build an agent and it was literally an administrator or an S3 kind of wrapper, if you will, then I'm sure there's S3 policies that exist that would probably service that. In GCP, I know their policies are much more granular, or their custom roles are more granular. That in those cases, you can probably end up getting something like, administrator of this thing attached to this resource. really is, is easier to do if the application is going to be doing the administration of resources, of that particular resource.
Again, we kind of use development to learn. I don't know if we talked about this yet, but that those where the managed policy might come in handy is learning what's happening, what your application's doing in development, where you don't have data, where you don't have as much risk. Not going to say there's no risk, but when you don't have like network dependent connections to your production account, you don't have data. Learn from your development environment. You can use those managed policies to say, okay, well, now we have an idea what this should need in QA and move it on. Easier said than done, but it's better than nothing. And managed policies do have a place in that way. We kind of use them a little bit with the permission boundaries as well. You're going into a GUI, it's going to give you a role that you need. You can attach that, but permission boundaries would say that you can't, do something that's going to privilege or lead to privilege escalation. So I think those can be used in conjunction.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I would agree.
Thanks. Last question here, because Brad's kids are freezing at the bus stop. It's cold up there in Canada already.
Yeah.
Do you have GCP IAM evaluation, discovery, remediation capabilities? This is about Sonrai. The short answer is yes. We do work in GCP. We don't work as a traditional sort of discover, remediate, prioritize type style CNAP thing anymore. Our cloud permissions firewall is really more about proactive controls for least privilege at scope, whether it's at the GCP project level, right, the AWS OU level, what have you. And if you want to see more of that, we do have a 14-day free trial. Just go sign up. You'll get a tenant, and you can go poke around. It's available for AWS. I think it's available for GCP now. I'm not sure, Brad, if we launch that to trial, but it works for GCP. And that's it for us. Thank you guys so much, Brad and Cole. Really appreciate it. Those are their LinkedIns if you want to connect with them there. And Cole's always giving an update every week on what he's talking about with cloud teams sort of all over the country. Who knows where he is this week? He's sort of all over the place, but he's just learning and gathering intel all the time, so definitely worth a follow there. Everyone, thank you so much for attending. We'll see you next time, and that's it.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Yeah.